Hey guys, tonight we step into a polished Victorian drawing room. One with embroidered footstools, the scent of lavender polish, and a grand upright piano dominating the wall like a second altar. Candlelight shimmers on its ivory keys. You imagine? A young lady poised to play something delicate, a waltz, perhaps, or a somber nocturne. But before she even touches the first note, you sense it. Tension, not hers, his. The gentleman seated across the room shifts uncomfortably. You wonder why, in a society where etiquette ruled every breath, so many Victorian men found themselves glaring at a harmless musical instrument. You're about to find out, and you probably won't survive this with your image of romantic pianos intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into the thick velvet of Victorian domestic life, and there it is, the piano. It's more than a fashionable staple, it's the very pulse of the respectable middle-class home. Your boots echo on the polished floor as you inch toward the instrument. Eyeing the sheet music of the Maiden's Prayer resting on the stand. Sounds innocent. It isn't, to Victorian men. The piano wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a portal to everything they quietly feared about womanhood, emotion, and control. You sit across from the instrument and try to relax, but the room whispers of performance, judgment, and something worse, implication. The piano implied sensitivity, sentiment, and softness, all things a proper Victorian gentleman was raised to fear, or at least smother, and yet there it stood. Nearly 90% of middle-class homes owned one by the 1890s. It was more common than flushing toilets. A woman seated at a piano was the image of refinement. Her delicate fingers floating over ivory keys, her posture straight, her ankles defiantly crossed. This wasn't just music. It was femininity with a score, a silent code. And the man in the room. He wasn't just a listener. He was a participant. In a complicated ritual he didn't invent and didn't quite understand, you begin to hear the unspoken rules clink like teacups. A well-played sonatina could signal marriageability. A sloppy waltz, social death. For women, playing piano was a language of virtue, talent, and middle-class worth. For men, it was a silent test. Will she play sweetly enough to display restraint, but not so passionately as to suggest unruly emotion? It was like decoding a love letter written in Chopin, and suddenly you understand this was why Victorian men hated the piano. It wasn't the sound, it was the stage. Mainstream etiquette guides of the era, like the habits of good society, stressed the importance of musical accomplishment for women. It was how they communicated elegance without speaking. And men were expected to sit, nod approvingly, and gauge what? Her wrists, her self-control. Whether she could make her marriage bed as neatly as she played a sonata. Historians still argue whether men resented the instrument itself or the social roles it enforced. But what's clear is that this was never just about music. This was about power and its subtle imbalance. The fringe detail that really tickles your brain. Some men feared piano lessons would lead girls to erotic thoughts. Yes, truly. In some corners of Victorian paranoia, too much piano practice was thought to overstimulate the nerves, especially in the lower back. Hysteria, they whispered. A gateway to madness, to masturbation, to novels. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, people genuinely panicked about what a little too much Moonlight Sonata might awaken. The drawing room falls quiet for a second. You picture the gentleman pressed waistcoat, waxed mustache, hiding behind a newspaper, half listening. To his daughter play a gentle minuet. To him, this was less music hour and more domestic landmine. Would she be good enough? Too good? Not demure enough? Would she turn and ask him what she should play next? What if she wanted to compose something? That's when the fear really hit, when the piano turned from parlor trick to expression. Because once women began to play with meaning, once they pressed those pedals like punctuation, it stopped being decorum and became voice. in voice and a woman was deeply unsettling to many Victorian men. The music begins again, and this time, you hear it. The dread between notes. The social gymnastics in every measure. So next time someone mentions a dainty parlor recital, just know someone's father was sweating through his cravat, wondering if Chopin would ruin the season. You sit back as she begins her second piece. Something lively this time, light on the fingers, but sharp in its implications. You pretend to read the Illustrated London News, but you're really watching her hands. Her touch is graceful too. Graceful, maybe. Because in this moment, you're not just a listener, you're a candidate. In Victorian England, the parlor wasn't just a place for idle entertainment. It was a matchmaking arena. A woman's piano performance was a form of advertising, in-spoken, decorum-wrapped resume. And you, poor man in the corner chair, were being silently assessed. That's why Victorian men hated the piano. You weren't here for music. You were here to be ensnared. You remember the etiquette books, how they warned women to practice, but never boast. To play well enough to suggest refinement, but not so well as to overshadow a man. And yet here you are, helpless against the fluttering notes of the flower duet. It's no coincidence she's playing that one. Sweet, familiar, calculated. Because here's the real secret. The piano wasn't just a marriage filter for women. It was a hunting trap, baited with scales and etiquette. And Victorian men, despite all their top hats and titles, walked right into it. You think of Mr. James Fitzwilliam, young barrister of some repute, who once attended a Sunday tea where 3 sisters each played a piece. He married the one who fumbled the fewest notes. True story. Their union lasted 8 years, until she eloped with a French pianist. That's the thing no one says aloud. Once a man married the pianist, he was expected to keep a plodding dash forever. The piano lessons didn't stop, nor did the performances. The parlor became his prison. Every Thursday evening, as neighbors gathered and someone brought out fruitcake, he'd have to sit there with a fixed smile while his wife played the same 3 tunes she'd practiced since girlhood. And if she was truly skilled, the music got. Emotional Victorian men hated that. Music stirred things, made people feel things. And for men raised on empire, discipline, and the stiff upper lip, that was deeply inconvenient. A nocturne could undo a whole decade of stoicism, even worse. It could make a woman seem complex. Historians still argue whether this discomfort came from emotional repression or social strategy. But either way, a piano piece with too much expression could unnerve the average gentleman more than a political scandal. And then there was the threat of comparison. If she played beautifully, what could he do in response? Quote Cicero, "Adjust the gas lamp." Few Victorian men were trained in music. Those who were often clergymen or aristocrats risked being labeled feminine for showing too much interest. So in most homes, music became a feminine domain. One men entered only to be judged or outclassed. That's not to say men avoided music entirely. Some took to the violin or the organ, instruments considered more intellectual, less domestic. But the piano? The piano was pink ribboned, purgatory. A man seated at one was either a bachelor, a joke, or in love. You think back to an infamous illustration from Punch magazine, showing a gentleman nervously sweating while a lady played piano with such fervor that her hairpins came loose. Caption read, "Mildred makes her intentions loud and clear." That was the fear. Piano playing was coded courtship. And in a society obsessed with class, propriety, and matching fortunes, this made every sonata feel like a trapdoor. You were expected to listen politely and maybe offer a compliment, but not too enthusiastic a compliment. That implied interest, or worse, marriage. You remember your friend Arthur, who complimented a young woman's expressive touch during a recital in Surrey? He spent the next 5 months engaged, said it was like stepping on a rake. What's more, once engaged, the piano became a constant. You thought it was charming once, but now it's inescapable. It's playing as you try to write correspondence. It's playing during arguments. It's playing while your child teething in the next room. It's the background music to your entire life, a little something you didn't know. In some households, the piano was locked when guests left, the key stayed with the mother of the house, was power disguised as polish. And every man knew once a woman had keys to her own expression, she might not stop at choppin'. Eventually, you learn to smile at the music, to nod and say lovely after every performance. But deep inside, you start to dread it. Not just the sound, but the weight. The way it makes you feel observed. It's the way it exposes the walls between you and your own feelings. That's why Victorian men hated the piano, because in a world where women were supposed to be seen and not heard, the piano let them be both loudly. The music swells, and you realize this isn't just background noise anymore. It's become atmosphere, mood, a kind of moral signal. That soft trill in the upper register. Innocence. The bold left-hand arpeggios, temperament, a missed note, perhaps a lapse in character. You never thought an A-flat could carry so much social pressure. That's the thing about the Victorian piano. It wasn't just an instrument. It was a virtue machine. You shift in your chair as she plays home, sweet home, with dutiful precision. Her face betrays nothing, but her fingers are giving you a full resume. Obedient, practiced, tasteful. This wasn't performance, it was branding. And the audience wasn't just you. It was every parent, chaperone, potential in-law listening from behind the curtain. In this culture, woman was expected to play the piano well, but not professionally. That would be vulgar. She was to be good enough to impress guests, but not so good that she made the gentleman uncomfortable. Kind of musical tightrope. Display enough grace to attract a husband, but not enough fire to threaten his ego. And you. You were expected to assess politely, quietly, completely. Pianos in this era were like X-rays for virtue. A girl who practiced diligently was presumed to have moral fortitude, discipline, the kind of woman would iron your shirts and raise quiet, obedient children. Meanwhile, one who played with passion or improvisation, risky, emotional, perhaps a little too French. Historians still argue whether these domestic performances gave women more freedom or simply new constraints. But one thing is clear. Every melody carried moral weight. Your tea goes cold as she plays. Another hymn like peace. The implication is clear, she's pious, in case you missed it. Many girls were trained to perform religious selections as a signal of purity, chastity, and humility. Not because they liked the tune, but because you were watching. You glanced down at the music stand, the angels whisper. Of course, even the titles were coded messages. Girls didn't choose their repertoire based on mood. They chose it. To construct a persona pure, but not naive, refined, but not rebellious, devoted, but not dull. And once again, piano was the tool of this unspoken campaign. Now here's where it gets strange. There were actual manuals that prescribed which songs were most appropriate for young ladies to perform based on their age and marital status. One guide suggested that unmarried girls avoid anything too operatic. Married women could tackle more complex works, but only after the children were asleep. God forbid a child overhear La Traviata and ask questions. Some families even hosted what were essentially musical pageants. A young lady would sit at the keys in her best frock, while an assembly of stiff-collared men evaluated everything from her technique to the curve of her smile. And what they were really deciding was, is she suitable? You, the gentleman, were caught in that web, too. You couldn't just decline an invitation to hear her play. That would be rude. But listening too closely might suggest deeper interest. Out. And God help you if you complimented the wrong piece. I adored her interpretation. If Schubert could land you in an engagement faster than you could say ball and chain. Want a quirky tidbit? Some etiquette experts advise women to never play pieces composed by Liszt or Beethoven too masculine. Too stormy, too likely to stir unrest. Instead, they were steered toward bland, floaty salon music designed to please without provoking it. Was the musical equivalent of cucumber sandwiches. And yet, within that restraint, women sometimes found rebellion. A girl might slip in a brisk polonaise instead of a docile mazurka, or change the tempo subtly, infusing a genteel tune with quiet ferocity. It was dangerous. It was thrilling. And it never failed to unnerve her suitor, who couldn't. Quite named the feeling, but wanted to bolt for the billiards room. You recall the story of Clara Danvers, daughter of a London merchant, who once played Chopin's funeral march during a family tea when her father refused her request to travel? Abroad, scandalous. But no one could really punish her. It was just music. She married a publisher and never touched a piano again. That was the curse and the trick. The piano gave women a voice. But not to say it let them perform emotion, but not act on it. To communicate longing, but only as Melodonna's will. And that made men twitch because each song you heard wasn't just melody, it was a message. She might be telling you she was bored, or clever, or tired of pretending she liked cake more than poetry. But you couldn't confront her about it, because if you did, she'd simply say, "Oh, it's just a little tune." You'd sit back down, defeated by a waltz. The room grows quiet. The last note hovers in the air like a question. She smiles demurely. You clap softly. And for a moment, you wonder if she's winning some game you didn't know you were playing. That's the genius of the piano in Victorian society. It told you everything, without ever letting you answer back. You sit still, fingers loosely steepled, listening as yet another piece begins, this time a fluttering etude, charming and harmless on the surface. But by now, you've learned to hear beneath the notes. Each one is a move on a social chessboard, and the instrument has ceased being neutral. It's become a threat, because as the 19th century rolled on, and more women were taught to read music, memorize sonatas, and even compose, the piano evolved. It was no longer just a symbol of domestic. Training it became, quite dangerously, a voice of female agency. And nothing prickled the mustache hairs of the Victorian male ego more than that. That's why. In parlors across London and Edinburgh and Bath, many men began to quietly resent it. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about threat in 88 keys. You glance at your boots polished to a mirror sheen and wonder, when did it start feeling like she had the upper hand? Somewhere between Greensleeves and that aggressive bit of Mendelssohn, the piano had morphed into something uncomfortably powerful. Because with every key she pressed, she wasn't just playing a tune, she was reminding you she could. She could express herself. She could draw a crowd. That she didn't need to say a word to fill the entire room. Historians still argue whether Victorian women truly found autonomy through musical education or whether it was just a more gilded cage. But one thing is certain, as women grew more, proficient men grew more paranoid. You remember reading an editorial in the Times around 1872 warning that too much musical ability in a woman may lead to eccentricity, emotional excess, and opinions. They said, "Heaven forbid." So what did men do in response? Some laughed it off. Piano playing became a punchline in satirical prints and caricatures. Women tickling the ivories while men winced in exaggerated agony. It was safer to mock than admit intimidation. Others enforced stricter limits. One music tutor, Mr. Baines of Surrey, reportedly banned his students from ever playing in public for fear that it would lead to ambitions unbecoming a lady. And then there were the gentlemen who simply retreated. They filled their clubs and drawing rooms with billiard tables, cigars, and silence anything to avoid those emotional crescendos rising from the parlor. You can't help but smile at the irony. Men ruled the banks, the courts, the parliament, but a simple walnut upright could send them fleeing like startled deer. There's a story about Sir Ambrose Bellingham P., landowner, known for his booming voice in the Commons. At home, he was terrified of his daughter's playing. She was talented. At every soiree, she'd draw murmurs of brilliant touch and expressive phrasing. Sir Ambrose started insisting on scheduling her lessons during his absences. By the end of his life, he had the piano moved to the attic, said it was bad for the woodwork. Right. You watch her now, gliding through another piece, and realize something else. The piano was also a test men never agreed to take. They weren't trained in it, weren't judged by it, and yet they were constantly being measured against it. You were supposed to be the authority, the suitor, the husband, the head of household. And yet here she was, commanding attention, setting tone, shaping mood with a flick of her wrist. And, The worst part? She was applauded for it. Another joke in Victorian circles: if you want a wife, court the girl who plays piano. If you want peace, marry the one who listens. Bitter laughter, always followed by the faint tapping of another practice scale in the distance. Want a fringe tidbit? Some men genuinely believed certain piano pieces could soften the mind and make women more open to suggestion, so they encouraged certain melodies once they found soothing, predictable. Men trying to curate a soundtrack to shape a personality, as if music were a form of emotional taxidermy. But women weren't dumb. They saw the trap, and sometimes leaned right into it. Played sweet, soft little ballads while plotting travel plans. Lulled their husbands with lullabies, then handed them bills for new furniture. Played submissive tunes while mastering more expressive ones in secret. Yes, secret. More than a few girls in the 1880s were known to hide forbidden sheet music, operatic, exotic, emotionally rich compositions beneath the folds of religious hymnals. In public, they performed the required Ave Maria. In private, they played Verdi until the candles burned low. One governess, Miss Elise Cartwright, taught both sets of music. She called them parlor songs and attic songs. In one household, a curious son found the attic manuscripts and asked if they were witchcraft. His mother said yes and told him never to mention it again. The parlor grows quiet again. She finishes, folds her hands, and looks up not at you, but past you, as though her thoughts are still ringing in the air. You feel it in your chest, not the melody. The loss of control. That's what the piano truly threatened for Victorian men. Not embarrassment. Agency. The terrifying idea that the softest girl in the room might also be the loudest voice, and she didn't need to raise it once. The applause is polite, but brief. The tea has gone tepid. You're still seated, but you feel like you've just come out of a sparring match and you lost. Not publicly, of course. You still wore the correct smile. Still nodded in time, too. The music still offered that vague, gentlemanly, charming, really, but she knows. Everyone knows, the piano one, and that's the turning point you dread. Because somewhere along the polished veneer of Victorian civility, the piano became a weapon. Not in the smashing over the head sense, though, given enough frustration. Perhaps but a tuned weapon, finely calibrated to create tension, correction, and even humiliation. And in a world where women couldn't speak freely, the piano offered an even more pointed tool. Passive aggression in three-quarter time. You sip your tea. It's bitter now. The war was never declared, but it was everywhere. One wrong phrase from you, and suddenly she's pounding out the lost chord with an intensity that rattles the family porcelain. You fail to notice her new haircut? Out comes a Hungarian rhapsody. Takes the wallpaper down a notch. Victorian men hated the piano, not only because women played it, but because they played through it. You remember an anecdote from Lord Trenwith, a magistrate and self-proclaimed moralist who once claimed that domestic music stirs up more household conflict than politics. His wife, Lady Trenwith, was known for playing overly loud polkas after every disagreement. He banned her from the parlor piano. She bought another. Historians still debate whether women used music to manipulate or simply to survive. But the fact remains, the parlor piano offered a unique channel for expression in an otherwise speech-policed life, and it wasn't just the wives. Mothers used the piano to shape their daughters. You walk into a sitting room and see it. Play out. The lesson, the praise, the correction. Faster, softer, less feeling. The piano became a battleground between generations of women, the father watching awkwardly from the settee, unsure whose side to take. In many households, musical taste was political. A preference for Bach over Chopin could suggest conservatism, religious leanings, or emotional restraint. A daughter requesting Debussy? That was code for, I've been reading French literature, and I have questions that sound you hear. A piano bench scraping back in horror. Then there's the husband who fancies himself the alpha, the man of the house. He controls the estate, the bills, the inheritance. But he walks into the parlor, and his daughter's playing a nocturne that makes the guests go quiet. And for a fleeting moment, he's irrelevant. A side character in his own home. Imagine being unseated not by a duel or a scandal, but by a 17-year-old's rendition of Clair de Lune. Want a strange tidbit? Some gentlemen in the 1880s began to purchase silent pianos. Not a joke, these were training instruments where the hammers could be muted, so the girl could practice without disturbing the men's reading. Let her play, they said, but quietly. A whole generation of women learned to express themselves in silence. Meanwhile, the sheet music itself evolved. By the late Victorian period, love ballads flooded the market. Titles like "I Heard Your Voice in the Garden" and "When My Heart Was Young" became bestsellers. Men dreaded them, because their wives would sing them at them during dinner. No eye contact. Just implications. You hear it again now. That heavy-handed rendition of "She Wandered Down the Moonlit Path"? It's not subtle. It never was. The piano was the perfect domestic tool for unspoken judgment. It didn't scream. It sighed, loudly. Imagine you come home late, smelling of cigars and club conversation, and instead of scolding, your wife begins to play The Forsaken Rose. You sit, you listen, you sweat. And not once does she raise her voice. In some households, music even replaced arguments. Entire disagreements were resolved by what was played that evening. It became code. A whole marital dialect rendered in B minor. One especially petty use. There are letters describing how mothers would invite multiple eligible young ladies to a gathering and ask them each to play something in turn. It became a social duel. What? If one girl played the Blue Danube, the next might whip out Faust Waltz just to assert dominance. The boys didn't stand a chance. And still, the fathers clapped, because rejecting the performance would be rude, and embracing it meant giving in. So they hated it. Not openly, but quietly, in their diaries. In the way they disappeared to tend the garden when music time approached, in the way they sighed too loudly after the second encore. You feel that same sigh rising now. Not because the music is bad. It's beautiful, because you realize what the piano really is, a mirror. One you didn't ask for. One that reflects your control slipping, your assumptions cracking, and your role shifting. And there's no stopping it, because as long as the piano remains in the corner of the parlor, polished, tuned, and waiting, someone will play it. And that someone will likely not be you. The music starts again. Something softer this time, maybe even mournful. You recognize the tune, vaguely. It's one of those pensive Victorian parlor pieces with a name like Dreams of Yesteryear, or A Whisper on the Moor. Sentimental. Delicate and somehow subversive, because by now you understand, beneath the proper tempo and pretty trills, lies something that unsettles the Victorian male psyche. Emotion, not just the tidy kind, the messy, inconvenient, opinion-shaped kind. That's what makes this dangerous. You lean back in your high-backed chair and realize this piano isn't just a symbol of refinement anymore. It's a source of rebellion, cunningly wrapped in velvet and etiquette. And rebellion, in the age of empire and rigid gender roles, was a terrifying prospect. By the 1880s, girls were playing better than ever. Music education had become widely accessible, especially for the rising middle class. It was fashionable, yes, but it was also functional. You had a daughter, you bought a piano. Not because you expected her to perform at Covent Garden, but because you expected her to be desirable, yet the plan backfired. Because those girls practiced more than expected, played longer than intended, and sometimes they started asking why they weren't allowed to play in public, or study composition, or, God forbid, write their own pieces. That's when the muttering began. Too much piano, too independent. In feminine touch. Historians still argue whether the piano was a bridge to emancipation or simply another form of ornamentation. But in countless letters and journals of the period, there's a clear pattern. When girls played expressively, they were dramatic. When they played assertively, they were unladylike. And when they played better than the boys, were politely asked to stop. You remember Miss Celia Bramley, age 17, whose nocturnes drew such applause at a summer garden party that 2 of the bachelors in attendance reportedly left early, muttering something about emotional manipulation. Celia was banned from performing solo for the rest of the season. Instead, she accompanied others, softly, and what of hysteria? Yes, the medical mystery of the Victorian age. Entire treatises were written about female nervous disorders, often linked to overstimulation of the nerves of the imagination of the fingers. And what else requires constant repetitive finger motion? You guessed it, piano practice. A fringe pamphlet from 1883 warned parents not to let girls linger too long at the keyboard unsupervised. It excites the mind beyond the bounds of propriety. That's right. Victorian doctors feared the piano might lead to moral collapse or worse. Opinions about the Corn Laws. Meanwhile, of course, no one ever accused a man of hysteria for playing the cello. You glance again at the sheet music. It's titled The Silent Yearning. A little on the nose, perhaps? But you get the message. This is a language designed for the unsaid. You begin to realize just how much women were smuggling into these performances. Hopes, frustrations, entire inner lives, because they couldn't write editorials, couldn't vote, couldn't always speak freely in their own homes, but they could play. One mother in Leeds famously told her daughter, "When you cannot say it, play it." And that daughter went on to become one of the first female music teachers in her county, though. Notably, she still wasn't allowed to sign contracts without her husband's name. That's the paradox. The piano was both a pedestal and a leash. It gave women access to something close to selfhood, but only within a very specific box one they were expected to decorate. Not escape, and yet escape they did. Quietly, some girls played popular tunes from the colony's ragtime rhythms brought back by sailors and travelers. Their mothers disapproved. Their fathers left the room. But they played anyway. It was a soft rebellion, syncopated and smiling. Others composed secretly, tucked scores under mattresses, wrote lyrics between recipe pages, shared forbidden harmonies. With cousins and governesses, some even submitted work under male pseudonyms, like E.W. Featherstone or C.T. Russell. A few of these pieces are still in circulation today and credited. Of course, you think of Lucy Elbridge of Sussex, who taught piano for 30 years and wrote over 40 original pieces. None of them were published. But one of her melodies, Evening Fog, was discovered in a student's exercise book and later sold to a London publisher under a man's name. It was reviewed as unexpectedly sensitive for a gentleman. Of course it was. And through all this, the Victorian man sat in his corner chair half listening, half dreading, wholly unable to respond in kind, because he didn't have the vocabulary. Not in words, not in music. He was fluent in law, Latin, and land inheritance, but not in the subtle rebellion of a well-timed crescendo. And that's why he hated the piano, because it gave women the last word, not through argument, but through melody, not with shouting, but with something far more dangerous. A tune people remembered. You sit now in a house gone quiet. Piano is still there, of course, hulking and heavy in the corner of the parlor like a memory no one dares move. Its keys are yellowing. A few sit uneven. Someone's forgotten to dust the top, and the metronome ticks irregularly, if at all. But it's still standing. That's the thing about instruments of change. Even after their music fades, the shape of them remains waiting. By the 1890s, status of the piano was shifting. You'd think by now, Victorian men would have made peace with it. But in truth, they didn't win. Not really. What they did instead was try to drown it out. In came the player piano, a mechanical marvel that let families play without skill or soul. No longer did one need to study Chopin or correct a girl's left hand. Posture just pumped the pedals and let the rolls do the rest. The irony. Men loved it. It returned control, made music mechanical, predictable, man-made. Then came the phonograph, scratchy, warbling revolution that finally took the power of live performance out of the home and into the horn. Suddenly, music was for listening, not learning. Could consume sound the way you consumed literature, passively. No more awkward recitals, No more spirited daughters with too much fort. Just discs, dispassionate, disposable, historians still. Argue whether this marked liberation or erasure. Did it free women from parlor performance expectations, or did it strip them of one of their only respectable creative outlets? You lean in now, because you can almost hear the last era groaning. There were mothers, pianist mothers, who cried quietly as their daughters lost interest. No more morning scales, no more soft duets after tea. One wrote in her diary, "She prefers Mr. Edison's box to my sonatas. I have lost her to the future." It was happening everywhere. Music schools closed or rebranded. Pianos began appearing in pawn shops. By the Edwardian era, a finely tuned upright no longer guaranteed admiration. In fact, some began to see it as a relic, sign of pretension. Dead weight, and yet those old pianos clung on. You'd find them in boarding houses, convents, rural manors, and forgotten parlors. The ones with cracked ivory and silent pedals, they became furniture, ghosts of their former selves. And in some households, the hatred lingered too. Even as the world changed, you'd hear mutters about that dreadful contraption. Not because it still made noise, but because it once had. Because it had given voice to those who were expected to remain quiet. And once you give someone a voice even through music, you can't unhear it. You think again of the countless daughters who sat, spine straight, before their pianos trying to be pleasant, pretty, perfect, trying not to play too loud, not to be too clever, not to make the men uncomfortable. And still, the men screamed, because behind every scale and sonatina, there was something Victorian men feared more than scandal or socialism: female self-expression. You recall the oddities. The parlor doors that were always closed when Miss Judith played. The father who insisted his daughter wear gloves, even while practicing. The brother who accidentally snapped strings when left alone with the instrument. The suitor who wrote, "She is lovely, but her playing unnerves me." He married someone quieter. So you understand now why Victorian men hated the piano, not because it was loud, not because it was feminine, but because it was both loud and femina, combination they had no tools to handle. It didn't argue, it didn't fight, it simply played, and the notes lingered long after the room emptied. A middle-class girl who'd never be allowed to speak out in church could move you. 2 tears with an evening sonata. A governess could imply volumes about her inner world through a minor key variation. And once you've heard someone's soul in music, you cannot pretend it's silent. No matter how tightly you shut the parlor doors, some men came to tolerate it. Fewer embraced it, most ignored it. But the piano never forgot. And now, as you sit here, long after the Victorians themselves have faded to sepia, you wonder if we've learned much at all. The instruments may have changed. The rules certainly have. But the struggle over who gets to be loud and who must remain pleasing still echoes. Even now, somewhere in the world, a young girl sits at an old piano, fingers poised, parents watching. And though the room may be warmer, the burden hasn't fully lifted. But she plays anyway, and the keys remember. And now, as the last notes fade into stillness, you exhale. The parlor is empty. Dust settles in slow spirals through a shaft of golden lamplight. The piano, so heavy, so haunted, is closed. Silent again, but not forgotten. You lean back into the softness beneath you, aware of the hush in your own room now. No ticking metronome, no scolding music master, just the hum of electricity, a blanket's weight. And you're breathing, inhale, exhale. Somewhere beyond this room, history still lingers. In the creak of old floorboards, in the polished leg of a forgotten upright. In the way music carries more than melody, it carries memory, emotion, defiance, grief, joy, longing. You picture those long-departed hands, small, determined, nervous, hovering over keys, hoping not to disappoint, practicing not for applause but permission, and every now and then breaking the rules, adding a flourish, striking a dissonant note, smiling. They were not just playing scales, they were saying, "I am here and now," As the room around you begins to blur, so are you. Your thoughts drift like soft harmonies. Your shoulders grow heavier, your breath slower. Whatever tensions the day delivered, the night now eases them. Because here, in this hush, you are safe, you are still, you are heard. Let the world recede. Let the silence sing. You made it so close your eyes now, darling. Let the old piano rest.